Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 11 waiver wire targets for the 2019 fantasy football season. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about some news around the National Football League in terms of players who had breakout games in Week 10 and some injuries that took place that are going to affect the entire landscape of the fantasy football community. Then going into my waiver wire targets for Week 11 at the running back, wide receiver, tight end, quarterback, and defensive positions. Before we begin today's video, let me remind all of you, if you haven't yet already, join the community, click that subscribe button, and make sure you do not forget to click the bell notification button to stay up to date. It updates you when my latest piece of content has come out on a daily basis. And also, if you like today's video, don't forget to hit the like button. Hey guys, how's it going? Before we begin, just off the top, it is Veterans Day, so happy Veterans Day for those of you who are retired, reserve, active military. I want to go ahead and thank you for your selfless service to this country. Without you, I mean, it's hard to explain, but we all do really appreciate your service. So I wanted to start off from the top, thanking all of our veterans, again, retired, reserve, or active currently. You guys make the world's difference for this country, so thank you again for your service. All right, so now that we've went over that, we can get into today's video talking about a little bit of news around the National Football League, right? So a couple pieces of information. I wanted to go over some injury news because that's typically the most relevant thing. Off the top, Austin Hooper left yesterday's game with an injury. He will be having an MRI later today, which can confirm either the worry or concern that the organization has for his said injury, or it could just confirm that he'll be out for a couple weeks. He's going to miss some time, according to what I've heard, which is extremely unfortunate because he was the number one tight end going into Week 10. Now, what does that kind of leave the Atlanta Falcons organization after they picked up a win against the New Orleans Saints? That's right. The 1-7 Falcons beat the New Orleans Saints. I mean, we'll talk about Week 10 in a little bit, but just a little taste of that's pretty surprising. Austin Hooper's injury could honestly just boost Calvin Ridley and Julio Jones going forward. You know, again, if Austin Hooper's down, and then there's Devontae Freeman also dealing with an injury. That's why Brian Hill yesterday, who's to the left of me on the running back list, Brian Hill came in, had 20 rushing attempts for the Atlanta Falcons and actually played pretty well, scored himself a touchdown, double-digit points overall. If, in fact, Devontae Freeman is going to miss a significant amount of time, Brian Hill, because Ito Smith is already on the injured reserve, would be a huge contributor to this offense going forward. So Julio Jones, Calvin Ridley, Brian Hill could be the three benefactors to these unfortunate injuries taking place, with Devontae Freeman, Austin Hooper, and then obviously Mohamed Sanu being traded just a couple weeks back. So that's pretty relevant news. Also, pieces of information that came out. Chris Herndon, the tight end savior that was going to save everyone's leagues and that never really showed up this year because as soon as he came back from suspension, he had a hamstring injury, never saw the light of day. And now he has a rib injury, and according to Adam Gase, he will be missing a significant amount of time going forward. So that is really unfortunate, but is it really a surprise? I don't think so. So Ryan Griffin continues to be a decent tight end within said offense in good matchups as they will continue to have going forward. Moving on, in terms of injuries, Tyler Boyd left the game yesterday with an apparent leg injury. If in fact he's going to miss time, we'll talk about some waiver wire pickups for that team. Again, there is still no sign of AJ Green returning, so it would probably be between Audin, Tate, or Alex Erickson being Ryan Finley's favorite target. We already saw Tyler Eifert get a little bit of work in the red zone. Joe Mixon ran the ball 30 times. That's correct. Joe Mixon, prior to Sunday, ran the ball 70 times this year. And then on Sunday, decided, you know what? We're going to feed Joe Mixon the ball 30 times. 3 games worth of, attempts all in one game. And his yard per carry average wasn't beautiful, but he got the job done in terms of fantasy production. So that was great. Other than that, let me see if I'm forgetting any other news because I'm sure I am. James Conner should be returning this week. Dwayne Haskins has been named the starting quarterback of the Redskins rest of season. That is correct. There is no more Case Keenum returning, which is very interesting. Saquon Barkley will be he'll have his x-rays done because he left the game with an apparent shoulder injury, which is pretty much why he had the lack of production. As soon as he left, Paul Perkins came in There was a little bit of sprinkles with Wayne Gallman, but again, nothing is going to be able to really supplement for Saquon Barkley and his kind of presence in that backfield. Outside of that, everything seems to be quota and up to par. Obviously, we were shocked yesterday morning to hear that. I mean, we weren't really shocked. The reports were kind of everywhere that Matthew Stafford could miss Sunday due to the back injury. This is something that he's been dealing with for the last couple years now. This is the same injury from last year, dealing with his back. So if he's going to miss significant time going forward, obviously Ryan Finley, still not that bad of a quarterback. Like I mentioned yesterday on the live stream, he's not that bad of a quarterback. He played well for the Bengals the year prior when Andy Dalton went down with an injury and went to the IR. So again, we could still see some production as we did. We still saw some decent production from Kenny Golladay and Marvin Jones against a very, good secondary. So that was exciting to see. But that's pretty much it in terms of news. If anything else is to shake or go down in the coming days, we'll definitely go into that and talk about that. But let's talk about my Week 11 running back targets and waiver wire targets for the 2019 season really quickly. I want to confirm. So going into Week 11, the bye weeks will be for 4 different teams, starting off with the Packers, the Giants, the Seahawks, and the Titans. If you do have any of those players, unfortunately, they will be out this week. But we do have 6 teams returning. So there's going to be a lot more players to at least throw into your lineup. You don't really have to worry about going to the waiver wire too heavily. But if, in fact, you are in need of players, these are the players that I wanted to talk about today. Number 1, Ronald Jones. We've talked about Ronald Jones so often on the Waiver Wire Monday show that at this point, this is the last week I'm going to talk about him. Ronald Jones must be picked up. And the fact that he is not owned in more percentage of leagues than I have seen potentially is quite surprising to me. Ronald Jones was given a streamline of production this past Sunday against the Arizona Cardinals to the point where we're thinking, wow, is this guy actually a legit running back? Because from prior to what we had seen, we thought to ourselves, well, Ronald Jones, he can never win the job. He's not good enough. He can never hit the hole. His speed is great, but he's never able to utilize it. He can't even beat Peyton Barber out for a job, blah, blah, blah. All the speculation of whether or not Ronald Jones could get the job done. And yesterday, we really did see Ronald Jones, even though there was still Peyton Barber with stealing a touchdown on the goal line, getting 11 rushing attempts on the ground. We did see this team really rely on Ronald Jones in the passing game. 8 for 8 in the passing, 8 targets, 8 receptions, 77 receiving yards. Still had a rushing touchdown on the ground. Had himself 11 rushing attempts, which is perfectly fine. But overall, had himself a very good game. And I do believe his ownership has to be topped off. He's only owned in 74% of leagues. And if you play in a 12-team league, he's probably already owned. But for those of you playing in 10, 8, he needs to be owned. He's the starting running back of this team, and he's getting a lot of production. Even with guys like Gumbawale and Peyton Barber in that backfield, he is still getting a lot of work, and going forward should be good. I mean, obviously some of the matchups coming forth, the New Orleans Saints is not great, but again, if you're going to get work in the passing game, playing against the Saints, not a big deal. Atlanta the following week, Jacksonville, Indianapolis, Detroit. These are not terrible matchups whatsoever. And I think Ronald Jones definitely needs to be owned. All right, moving on to number 2, Brian Hill. Speaking of Brian Hill, I talked about him a little bit earlier. Obviously, due to the injury that was sustained by Devontae Freeman, it is without a doubt in my mind that Brian Hill is the number 1 running back of the Atlanta Falcons going forward. The Atlanta Falcons take on the Carolina Panthers this week, and from what we've seen, the Carolina Panthers get completely dropped on their head on a weekly basis. It leads me to believe that Brian Hill is a automatic top 24 running back going into this week. I mean, the Carolina Panthers in the past 3 weeks had Tevin Coleman have a monster game. Tevin Coleman had a monster game. Derrick Henry had a monster game. Aaron Jones had a monster game. 3 back-to-back weeks. 3 of the best running backs in the National Football League. Sure, came in and dominating that defense. And I think Brian Hill, if in fact Devontae Freeman is to miss this week, is a guy that needs to be picked up, needs to be rostered, and potentially started this coming week against the Carolina Panthers. In this offense, Brian Hill is pretty much the only running back. So he's going to get work in the passing game as well, which is definitely going to lead to his success. That's where he found his touchdown, in the passing game. 1 catch, 10 yards, scored himself a receiving touchdown, perfectly fine down on the goal line. That's what we kind of expect from this offense. All right, moving on to number 3, Derrius Guice. So we have the return of the Redskins from their bye week. We have the confirmation that Dwayne Haskins will be the starting quarterback. Is this team moving towards the future? I say yes. So what does that lead me to believe? It leads me to believe that this team is going to play Derrius Guice over Adrian Peterson. Yes, Adrian Peterson's been very productive as of late, to be honest. He just had a 100-yard performance back in week 9 against Buffalo. But that being said, I do believe Derrius Guice is going to get the nod, and he is going to be given the ample opportunity to become this team's starting running back with as many touches as possible in order to get him back into the groove, because really we haven't seen any of Derrius Guice in the last 2 years. I mean, his rookie season never started. This year, I mean, it literally took him 1 week and he was gone. The Eagles game in week 1, injured, gone, finished IR. Hopefully he can come back with the young team that they're building with Haskins, McLaurin, and now Guice coming back from injury. Hopefully they can go towards the future, and that's why I wanted Darius Guice on this list. Moving on to number 4, Paul Perkins. Now, the Giants are going on a bye week. Saquon Barkley's results on his X-ray, MRI, whatever he ends up taking, have not been confirmed or denied. There's no information out at this time. But if, in fact, information is to be revealed that Saquon Barkley is significantly injured and is going to miss a set of time, I think Paul Perkins and or Wayne Gallman are guys that need to be picked up, one or the other. Now, we saw Paul Perkins take majority of the snaps on Sunday, especially on the ground. I don't know how much that is worth, but we have seen Wayne Gallman, when Saquon Barkley was out against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, have a huge 20-point fantasy performance and used a lot in this offense. The running back position, even though, yes, this team is not great at running the ball at times, they have found some success here and there in the passing game on the ground, and this is going to be a starting running back available if, in fact, Saquon is out. So we would want to go in and probably pick that up. If you're a Saquon owner, you probably want to pick up his handcuff. All right, moving on to number 5, J.D. McKissic. So from Sunday, besides Matthew Stafford missing the game, Ty Johnson, who is slated to have a pretty decent game against the Chicago Bears, had a concussion, went into concussion protocol, and left the game. Unfortunately, that does not leave the Detroit Lions with many options at this moment in time at the running back position, unless they go out and sign somebody. J.D. McKissic, the receiving back of this team, really, he is the receiving back of this team. He would have to pretty much pick up all of the work, which is not terrible, and I think that's honestly a good thing, because this team doesn't look like they want to run the ball in the second half of the season, especially if Finley's out there. Running the ball is probably not. I mean, obviously you want to run the ball with a less experienced quarterback, but Finley's not going to be out there the whole time. I think Stafford will return, and they're going to pass the ball heavily in order to win games because their defense isn't helping them very much. So as of right now, J.D. McKissic, not a bad option as a receiving back in a PPR format. Moving on, number 6, another running back that somehow surpassed 10-plus fantasy points, who isn't very much owned in fantasy leagues, only 57% ownage across leagues right now in Yahoo. A guy that, to be honest, is a 50-50 player. I think Tarik Cohen is very tricky to kind of determine whether or not he is going to have a big week because, let's be honest, I mean, Tarik Cohen is still the backup running back. He hasn't seen as much work as he did last year. This offense is very much so struggling. But if, in fact, Tarik Cohen can continue to get a good amount of targets coming in his direction, I think he could find value in the coming games. Really, there's some decent matchups. The LA Rams can't cover running backs out of the backfield. The New York Giants matchup's not bad. Detroit again in a couple weeks. This could be, a recipe for some sort of success. But again, this is a guy that's probably already owned. But I wanted to throw it out there. If you're playing in a PPR league, could be of value or service to you. Moving on. Before I end the running back section, I could have had Kareem Hunt here, but I already mentioned him last week. This is a guy that should have already been picked up, and his ownership is, it pretty much says he's already been picked up in majority of leagues. So as of right now, the guy had, 7 receptions for 44 yards, had 4 rushes for 30 yards, had a huge game, 10 points in his, return. Again, like I was mentioning, he could be a flex play. And as of right now, that looks like what he is potentially going to be going forward in this offense. All right, let's go in and talk about the wide receiver targets for Week 11. All right, so let's get into this, shall we? Starting off with number 1, Will Fuller. Will Fuller will be returning this week, as will the Houston Texans off of their bye week. The only reason I am mentioning Will Fuller is because of the fact that a lot of teams could have potentially dropped him in your leagues. This is a guy that is honestly so valuable in fantasy football with his usage within said offense of the Houston Texans. He is the number 2 wide receiver of this team. Really, from what we've seen of since his absence, Kenny Stills may have put together something here and there, but really, Will Fuller is much needed in this offense. We have seen a little bit of a boost in DeAndre Hopkins' production, so potentially the return of Will Fuller could stunt that growth in the right direction. But either way, Will Fuller should be picked up, should be a good option going forward, if in fact he has been dropped in your league. Moving on to number 2, Darius Slayton. The guy that finishes the number 2 wide receiver in fantasy this year, Darius Slayton had a monster game. Now, to kind of put it in perspective and just exactly what we saw on Sunday, Darius Slayton, prior to Sunday, had 17 receptions thus far this season. Just on Sunday, he had 10 receptions on 14 targets, pretty much making up all of his production in one singular game, having over 120 receiving yards and 2 receiving touchdowns against the New York Jets secondary, which, he wasn't the only one having a pop-off game. We had Golden Tate out here scoring 2 receiving touchdowns against the secondary. So, Daniel Jones, monster game, 4 touchdowns. His 2 top receivers had monster games. Obviously, Evan Ingram was out, and so was, Saquon Barkley for a majority of that game. So, who did he turn to? The next 2 men up, who really did produce and helped him out. Darius Slayton is a guy that, yes, they are going to bye week. Yes, Sterling Shepard could be looming for a return, but he has carved himself out a big enough portion of this offense that going forward could be used more and more, even if they're, potentially Sterling Shepard comes back. I think, Darius Slayton will have value. All right, moving on to number 3, Dede Westbrook. Coming off a bye week as well. If, in fact, somebody dropped Dede Westbrook in your league to pick up another player, I think this is a week you can pick up Dede Westbrook going forward, because the Jacksonville Jaguars schedule is quite favorable in the coming weeks and in the fantasy playoffs. They have Nick Foles returning this week as the starting quarterback. So what does that mean? Well, Nick Foles, as we know, loves to target the slot position, and that is not going to change. Sure, Gardner Minshew preferred his DJ Chark and potentially Chris Conley at times. Dede Westbrook is going to get an increase in production as soon as Nick Foles is on the field, and he is going to be on the field as the starting quarterback rest of season. So I think Dede Westbrook going forward, a great contributor and a good fantasy pickup this week. Moving on, Chris Conley also. Even though I do believe Chris Conley might get a little bit of a dip in terms of production, he is still another good fantasy option here that is available. There are enough pieces in this offense. When you have Fournette, you have Chark, you have Conley, you have Dede Westbrook. Those are only 4 players. That is enough. I can honestly see 4 consistent players from this offense, on a weekly basis, because they are going to be coming out. This is not a team that is completely out of the playoff picture. They can make a run, and they're going to definitely try to do so with Foles coming back now. So again, Chris Conley, another one of these players that you could potentially go and pick up. Moving on to number 5, James Washington. Of all the receivers for the Pittsburgh Steelers on Sunday, James Washington had the biggest week. 7 targets, 6 receptions, 90 yards, had a receiving touchdown. Unfortunately, on a big reception and run, he fumbled the ball. Could have had an even bigger game. Unfortunately, was not able to top off that performance with a big run or a couple other things there, but they got the W, and that's all that matters. James Washington pretty much was the only relevant Pittsburgh wide receiver yesterday. Juju Smith-Schuster, pretty much an absentee from that performance. On top of it, we had a little bit of Deontay Johnson. Jalen Samuels really didn't do much. Even Vance McDonald didn't do much. So really, it was the James Washington show, and potentially that could be the case going forward. The coming matchups are pretty favorable for this team. They have Cleveland, they have Cincinnati, Cleveland, Arizona, Buffalo, the New York Jets. Those games, in my opinion, are as easy as they come. So, yes, I personally want to have Juju Smith-Schuster on roster the rest of the season, but if I can just get one of the pieces here, maybe potentially James Washington could get more and more production in this offense. I don't mind that either. Moving on to number 6. Like I was mentioning earlier, we don't know the status of Tyler Boyd, but if in fact Tyler Boyd is going to miss any sort of time, Audin Tate, Alex Erickson will be the 2 men to step up and pick up said production. AJ Green does not look like he's coming back this week. If he does, and if anything changes, then sure. But I think one of these 2, Audin Tate had the second most targets on the team after Boyd. But Erickson will be filling into that slot position, who could also find himself some good production, because that's where Tyler Boyd had his 9 targets this week. So either one of those, whichever one you want to go ahead and take the risk on. I don't think they're too much of a risk, but again, Ryan Finley, he's still a learning quarterback, and he will have to eventually break into getting to where we want them to be in order to kind of trust them with our fantasy wide receivers. Moving on to number 7, Cole Beasley. All right, Cole Beasley gets to take on Miami Dolphins this week. Cole Beasley, I mentioned him many times on this waiver wire episode, and yet every week, this dude's a 10-plus point kind of guy every week, especially in a full PPR. In half PPR, he's like an 8, 9-point guy, 10-point guy every week for like the last month. And yet, there's probably a lot of you that do not have, or if you go to your leagues, Cole Beasley's probably available. And why is that the case? Well, it's because a lot of people probably just don't think Cole Beasley's that much of a wide receiver. They think to themselves, well, do I really want a Bills wide receiver? Do I really want Cole Beasley? How much work does he really get? I mean, looking at his performances this season, he has had, was that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 performances of 8+ points this season. And I mean, that's not a joke. This is actually pretty good production. Out of the last month, in the last 4 weeks, he has scored 3 touchdowns. This is not bad production at all. Obviously, his receiving count isn't fantastic, but he's getting the job done. Gets to play against Miami this week. Somehow Miami Dolphins show up and decide, you know what, we're going to beat the crap out of Brian Hoyer and the Colts, and they got it done. Wow, that's impressive. Moving on. The last wide receiver I wanted to mention is Demaryius Thomas. So, a month ago, literally a month ago, we talked about who could have the best rest of season schedule at the wide receiver position. We talked about T.Y. Hilton's, we talked about Tyler Lockett's, and we talked about the Jets wide receiver core. And obviously, from what we've seen thus far, it is Jamison Crowder as the number 1 wide receiver of that team. It is far and away Jamison Crowder. In the last 2 weeks, the dude has scored 16.6 fantasy points and 18.3 fantasy points. There's a reason why he is not on today's list because, to be honest, if Jamison Crowder is not already owned in your league, how dare you, number 1? But Demaryius Thomas has pretty much picked up exactly where we thought, potentially Bobby Anderson can be. Demaryius Thomas had a pretty good fantasy week here. Surprisingly enough, 9 targets, 6 receptions for 84 yards. A guy that is, pretty old, coming off of an Achilles injury, found himself some production in this offense, which is exactly what we want at the wide receiver position, and he found it. So either way, he is potentially a guy that you could pick up if you are desperate for a wide receiver. This week, they play against the Redskins, which is a team that has given up a lot of points to opposing wide receivers in the NFL. All right, moving on. Let's talk about my Week 11 tight end targets. Starting off with number 1, Jared Cook. I did mention Jared Cook is going to have a huge couple of weeks coming on. If you did watch the tight end episode, it is because of the matchups, coming in the coming weeks. I mean, let's just be honest. They play against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers this coming week. And then after that, let me go ahead and find Mr. Jared Cook's schedule. They get to play against Tampa Bay, Carolina, Atlanta again, then San Francisco, Indianapolis, Tennessee. To be honest, the next 3 weeks against Tampa Bay, Carolina, Atlanta, going into the fantasy playoffs, the next 3 weeks are pretty important. And I think a guy like Jared Cook could be a solid performer. He had 10 targets, 6 receptions, 74 yards in a tough game in which I probably could have seen him scoring against that defense. I did anticipate him scoring. Didn't happen, but the target counts, the production, I am perfectly fine with. Hopefully we can get back to what we saw last year of Jared Cook. Moving on to number 2, Kyle Rudolph. Kyle Rudolph in the red zone found himself 2 touchdowns yesterday, 5 targets, 4 receptions, only 14 yards, but he is becoming a red zone threat for this offense. We've seen him do that in the past for this team. At times, he will score a touchdown. In the last 4 weeks, he has scored 4 receiving touchdowns and 1 2-point conversion. So more and more as the season progresses, especially as of late, this guy has caught touchdowns for this team down in the red zone and is being used exclusively for that. Sure, Irv Smith will probably line up because of how many double tight end sets this team uses. They're going to pass the ball to Irv Smith, and that is not a secret. But again, Kyle Rudolph been pretty productive in the last month. Going forward, could have himself some similar production. Moving on to number 3, O.J. Howard, a guy I expected to have a big week, exactly did. Playing against the Arizona Cardinals is not a difficult task at hand for the tight end position. It hasn't been all year long, and thank goodness O.J. Howard finally showed up. He had a decent performance, scoring a touchdown, 4 receptions on 7 targets, 47 receiving yards. That's perfectly fine. Going forward, hopefully we can see more implementation of O.J. Howard in this offense. In the coming matchups, you have the New Orleans Saints, you have the Atlanta Falcons, Jacksonville, Indianapolis, Detroit. Like I've mentioned before, these are going to be back and forth shootouts. There is not a way in hell that the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are not involved in shootouts going forward. And I think O.J. Howard needs to get more involved, and hopefully he will off of that performance. Moving on, Mike Gesicki. I understand Mike Gesicki didn't have a huge performance against the Indianapolis Colts. They are a better defense than people give them credit to. Give them credit for. They get after it. They play well. That being said, Mike Gesicki going forward has a pretty decent schedule. Again, another one of these guys in this offense for the Miami Dolphins. Miami's won 2 in a row. Looks like they want to win more games. Looks like they're trying defensively, offensively. Or, Ryan Fitzpatrick's putting them in the right place. And in terms of receptions, it's either Mike Gesicki or Devontae Parker. And the coming schedule for the Dolphins. As soon as I read it, it's pretty much just money. It's really just money performances. Sure, he didn't have a great game yesterday. Still had 6 targets. That's the second week in a row in which he's had that. Buffalo, Cleveland, Philly, the Jets, the Giants, Cincinnati. Those are very easy games. For those of you looking for a tight end, maybe you had Austin Hooper go down. Mike Gesicki, not a bad option. Moving on, Noah Fant. Noah Fant, if in fact in the coming weeks continues to see more work, that's perfectly fine. He is one of the younger players on this team with Emmanuel Sanders gone. It's him and Cortland Sutton and Deshaun Hamilton. Potentially, Phillip Lindsay, Royce Freeman. They have a very young core of offensive players, and hopefully Noah Fant in the coming weeks after his bye week here will get some more usage. Moving on to Ross Dwelley. Here's the thing. I expect George Kittle to miss tonight's game. Ross Dwelley is the backup as of right now, the guy that stepped in for him last Thursday when he had that injury against the Arizona Cardinals. If, in fact, Ross is going to start tonight, they play against the Cardinals in Week 11 as well. So there is going to be some potential for this guy to get some production going forward. Obviously, we haven't seen tonight's game. If Jacob Hollister has himself a pretty big game, that's another guy that I want to go ahead and pick up because the Seahawks love to use their tight end position. But anyway, let's go ahead and move on. Let's talk about quarterbacks. All right, so let's go and talk about quarterbacks going into Week 11. Again, Jimmy Garoppolo gets to take on the Arizona Cardinals at home this time. We saw him throw 4 touchdowns against that defense the last time, and really everybody has a pretty good time playing against the Arizona Cardinals defense. So Jimmy Garoppolo is a good pickup if he's available. Nick Foles this coming week, again, another guy that I think is has a pretty decent matchup going forward. In terms of the quarterback position, Nick Foles, the one performance that we saw him do this season really wasn't that bad. I'm obviously we don't have too much of a sample size, but we know Nick Foles is not a joke of a quarterback. He's going to get after it. He's going to be able to produce at least some sort of fantasy production. How much production? Well, it's going to be a lot better than some of these other quarterbacks. It's going to be better than a Goff. It's going to be better than a Phillip Rivers. It's probably going to be better than Jacoby Brissett, who's injured, or Baker Mayfield, who has struggled at times. So as of right now, not a bad option. Plays against the Indianapolis Colts. Again, there's always a possibility that the Colts get smacked if their quarterback's not there, and a guy like Nick Foles can come in and find some production. All right, moving on. Josh Allen. Again, if Josh Allen's available, they play against Miami. That's a free matchup, 3 points, no problem at all. Moving on, number 4, Derek Carr. Derek Carr playing against Cincinnati Bengals. That is an easy matchup as well. Probably going to run the ball all over them. Josh Jacobs could be the number 1 running back on the week, but Derek Carr should be fantastic. Moving on to Kyle Allen, number 5, playing against the Atlanta Falcons. Atlanta Falcons played well. Their pass rush got after Drew Brees. They did not allow him to breathe in the pocket. Kyle Allen will be fine, and I think he's honestly in line for a pretty good week of production here. And then the last quarterback option, Sam Darnold. Sam Darnold played pretty well against the Giants. Gets to take on the Redskins, another defense that is not great. Sam Darnold could potentially have another good week here, which I anticipate him doing. Let's go ahead and move on. Let's talk about the defensive positions before we end today's video. Week 11. Dallas gets to play against, goodness gracious, why have I forgotten this? It's right here. Okay, beautiful. The Dallas Cowboys get to play against the Detroit Lions. If Ryan Finley is at quarterback, that could be something that you want to key in on, playing against lesser quarterbacks. Moving on to number 2, Buffalo Bills playing against the Miami Dolphins. Maybe this Miami Dolphins thing, it could explode at any moment. And I think the Buffalo Bills defense continue to score every week, get after the quarterback, cause a lot of chaos in the backfield, a team that we should continue to rely upon on defense. The Jacksonville Jaguars, another one of these teams. If, in fact, Jacoby Brissett misses another week, Brian Hoyer is a susceptible quarterback to throwing. He threw 3 interceptions. He threw 3 touchdowns against the Pittsburgh Steelers and turns around against Miami and throws 3 interceptions. Only Brian Hoyer can do that. So Jacksonville Jaguars, not a bad defensive option. The LA Rams playing against the Chicago Bears at home. I don't think, the LA Rams offense is going to do, from what we saw yesterday, yikes. Cooper Kupp didn't catch a single pass. It's incredible, right? But either way, I think their defense could make or force Mitchell Trubisky to struggle, because Mitchell Trubisky struggles all the time. And it's not hard to force him to make mistakes. So they could always put up some decent amount of points. The Denver Broncos, coming off of a bye week, could be available in your league playing against the Minnesota Vikings. I'm thinking to myself, there's got to be a team that pressures this offense eventually. Yesterday they were able to run all over Dallas's defense with just little resistance. And that's really been Dallas's big pitfall for the last 2 years. Their linebackers get mauled. For as talented as they are, as talented as Van Der Esch, Jalen Smith, and Sean Lee are, at the point of attack, guards and tackles are getting to the second level, and they are mauling these linebackers and dominating up front. For a defense that is so good at stopping the run, that the Denver Broncos are, I think they could force the Vikings to struggle if, in fact, they can get after Kirk Cousins, make him force some mistakes. Again, they only have Stephon Diggs out there, who they could lock down with Chris Harris. This could be a potential that the Denver Broncos put together a good performance here, have a slower scoring game. The last option, the New York Jets. The New York Jets get to take on the Washington Redskins. Against Dwayne Haskins, that's not a bad idea. I truly do not think this is a bad idea for something that could be available. This defense got after. They picked up a win. Maybe they're just pissed off. Maybe they want to continue to win. And I think that's the case. And I think the Jets are going to get after the Redskins and probably give them the smacking this week, because Dwayne Haskins really has struggled a lot this season. And I don't think that's slowing down or going to change just because of one bye week. All right, guys. Thank you, everybody, for watching. I appreciate you guys spending your time to watch my videos every day. Again, thank you again for all of you. Happy Veterans Day for those of you who have served in the military, retired, active, or reserve. Thank you again. We really do appreciate your service. And until tomorrow, we're going to be talking about we'll talk about running backs tomorrow for my start and sit. Later this afternoon, for those of you who are on Patreon, we have a Patreon live stream during the game, 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. So those are for you guys on Patreon. But again, thank you everybody for watching. And until next time, which will be tomorrow, I'll see you guys. Peace.